Hi, I'm Ed Getty.
I'm Geoff MacLean. Welcome, Ed. How you doing?
Great. We're here talk about disclosed dual agency today, and we can dive right into it and kind of, lay the groundwork here about what disclosed dual agency is really all about.
Yeah, obviously in these videos, this isn't everything about the whole topic, but we're going to dig into it a little bit here and introduce it and get talking about it a little bit. And
Yep.
it's, it's a policy, just choice, it's an option, and so in introducing this, we want to make sure that we are really, you know, um, you know, understanding, when we should be, we've got some policy decisions to make at the company. They're going to decide whether they can do dual agency or not do dual agency, right? And some companies choose to do it and some don't they, Ed?
Yeah, and you hit the key right at the beginning. Your company has to first, in their company policies, allow this type of relationship, and then up to the agent, along with the understanding between their designated broker, whether they're going to be doing that. But the company has to approve that first.
Right. And so what you got here is that the key issue with dual agency is you've got two clients of adverse interest in the same transaction. What are we talking about? Two clients, adverse interest in the same transaction, a seller and a buyer. They're represented by either under appointed agency, they're represented by the same appointed agent, or under single agency, they're represented by the company. Maybe Ed's working with the seller and Geoff's working with the buyer, but we are both dual agents because we have a single agency policy. And we really, the key thing is a heightened awareness of specific issues and obligations. You got to be careful. I've got two clients, they're looking at it, and we're going to dig into it a little bit here. Those two clients with adverse interest, some transactions this will work. Other transactions you wouldn't go near it with dual agency because of different factors that we'll talk
Mhm.
about in doing
Right.
this. So
Yeah.
you,
Well,
you,
let's talk about some of the key requirements for disclosed dual agency. Uh, Again, the dual agency occurs when a licensee represents both buyer and seller, as you mentioned. And in disclosed dual agency, you have twice those fiduciary duties. You remember, Geoff, we used to always teach about fiduciary duties and all that old card, those two words, to help everybody remember, what they are, from the obedience and loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, reasonable care, and diligence. You have that on both clients. Do you realize that? Right.
Yeah, and you said represent both buyer and seller, and the key thing here is in the same transaction.
Right.
Okay. And those fiduciary duties, you have them from two clients. And we'll see later on, they call it dual agency. There's a limitation in a couple of those relationships. The confidentiality and the obedience ones could be limited by the disclosure that they're going to sign when we serve two clients. And focus on fulfilling our obligations rather than the limitations. This isn't, there are things that a dual agent cannot do. There are disclosures that they can't make, willingness to pay more, willingness to take less. We'll get into it, but don't focus on the limitations of what I can't do. Really focus on what it is that you must do and how
Hmm.
that may be, not going to work in this transaction because of, disclosures that one side or the other does not want you to make to the other side. You're not a transaction broker. You're not a facilitator. You have two clients, you have two obediences, two loyalties. Sometimes that works. Some transactions that'll never work. I want to buy, some my current seller's listing. Let's get realistic here. I want to buy my current seller's listing, $750,000. I represent the seller and I'm going to represent myself. Okay, well, that's legal, but I
Hmm.
don't know, is this the right transaction to do dual agency in? If my own self-interest, juxtaposed against my obedience, loyalty, disclosure to the other side. Loyalty, put my seller's interest above my own. Does it pass the straight face test that I can do that? If I'm on the other side of the transaction.
I
Probably
don't,
not. And we'll talk,
probably not.
we'll talk a little bit about, evaluating that, is this the right deal for that, right? And
Yeah,
so appointed agency and single agency, it kind of I said a moment ago, I started talking about that a little bit. It lays out a little differently. Like under appointed agency, it occurs when an appointed agent, one licensee or maybe two licensees working together, are appointed to both clients, right?
right,
And under single agency, it's you know um, the agency can't represent more than the agency is representing both clients.
right,
You might be handling the seller and I'm handling the buyer, but it's dual agency because the agency doesn't do appointed, they do single agency only. I think one of the benefits of appointed agency in 1994 was it reduced the incidence of dual agency. Prior to appointed agency, any in-house transaction between two clients was a dual agency. Under appointed agency, Ed, you can represent the seller, I represent the buyer, and we're not doing dual. I don't owe the seller a fiduciary duty, and you don't owe the buyer a fiduciary duty. Under appointed, appointed reduced the incidence of dual agency 30 years ago, I think was a big reason why we came up with it at that time. Yep.
yeah, I agree, yeah, quite a difference there.
The
And,
clients get a say?
well, we also gotta have two clients when we can ever even be dealing with disclosed dual. You have two signed agreements.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, you
Yeah.
know?
And they got to be informed when dual agency comes into effect. So they said yes to dual, right? When they listed with you, but
Mhm.
if you don't have a buyer yet, you're not a dual, right? It's hypothetical when they're saying yes, right?
Right.
And you got to tell them when. When does it start? You know, does it does it start after the showing or before?
Well, before when I actually have that issue, okay? You know?
Yeah, first substantial communication. They said yes to dual, but I'm not a dual agent until I'm actually having a substantial communication with a client buyer that's interested in that seller's property, right?
And when are we gonna first even discuss dual agency, that real estate brokerage relationship form?
Yeah, we're gonna broach that topic. That'll be the first discussion. The listing agreement will be the second discussion. The showing will be the third. The purchase and sale agreement will be the fourth. You mean I got to talk about this more than once?
Yeah, right. And
Hey,
and more detail, I think, as you go on.
and newsflash, you're doing yourself a favor when you do, because that's that more that that explanation and discussion that I'm so fond of. It's amazing.
And we
Um,
have to get that permission, Jeff, also, ahead of time, at the time of the listing agreements, whether it's a buyer or seller,
yeah.
uh, for sure. Now, could they change their mind later?
Yeah, definitely. But the first time, we discuss this is with the brokerage relationships form. The second time will be prior to entering into a broker. At the time of brokerage agreement, we've got to have that written disclosure signed,
Right.
and yes or no. And I know some licensees, they put in their yes all the time. Well, I don't know how you put in it. Why is there a yes or no box? Well, there must be a no case, right? And you don't know whether it's a no case or not until you do a little explanation, until you do a little discussion with the client to determine whether this is a good case for dual agency. That's why how can you fill it out yes all the time? I don't get it. You know, if your agency policy is never to do it, the law doesn't require it to be done, and it might be no every time. But in those situations, actually, you don't even need to do the disclosure if your policy is we never do it. But a lot of agencies do it according to the right transaction, and they're going to be a yes or no. Um, and this implies, as it says here, the disclosure must happen, at the time of entering into a written brokerage agreement. They need to really understand this, and we're going to reaffirm that at showings and writing offers and halfway through the P&S agreement, right? You know,
Right.
So
law is
obligations, what kind of obligations and limitations are we talking about here, Ed?
well, it depends on, the parties, for sure. Again, some states don't even allow disclosed dual agency. In Maine, we do, okay? Uh, some of the responsibilities, again, some other duties, they include disclosing material facts pertinent to the transaction. Uh, and again, who are the parties involved? You gave kind of an example earlier. Uh, might be okay with the seller to start with, but they find out, oh, it's your brother, your mother, the buyer, they may not be okay.
Yeah.
So they're going to change. They're going to go in and out of this, I think.
Yeah. And obviously here in Maine, we're going to be talking about the Maine rules and regulations and laws. And as you said, I know of at least a couple of states that don't do it. I know lots of agencies that don't do it,
Right.
but that's an agency, that's a policy level decision at the agency whether or not to do it. And it can also be an agent by agent level decision as to whether I want to be a dual agent. Some agents work for companies that don't allow it, but that agent's personally uncomfortable. Remember, law, ethics, policy, how do I feel about it? They're personally uncomfortable. They don't have to say yes to dual. If the seller wants dual and you don't want to do it, then they need to find another licensee to do it. But you're under no obligation to have to do dual agency. And so in these situations, your policies, and it's going to be different at different companies. And so, you know, the dual agent has two clients. We're responsible for 7 fiduciary duties to both. There are some situations where, that in Maine, for example, we have a disclosure that says there that what I can't say. Okay. But what it also says is in that disclosure that I must disclose anything I know that's material to the transaction to both clients, except willingness to take less if from the seller, willingness of the buyer to offer more, confidential negotiating strategy, not disclosed in the sales offer, and the motivation of the seller for selling and the motivation of the buyer for buying. That's what I can't disclose, but I must disclose everything else. And that's what I think we were referring to earlier, where it says, don't focus on the limitations, focus on the obligation. The obligation is kind of buried in that statement where it says that I must disclose any information I get from one party to the other party unless it's one of those 4 exceptions. So it's interesting. There's only 4 things that I can't talk about. I must talk about everything else. So the devil's in having a discussion with the client to find out what else they don't want to have discussed to see whether there's anything there.
Hmm.
And maybe the seller doesn't have anything that they don't want to keep back. Some sellers have stuff they don't want to talk about, and other sellers have material facts that they're okay with being disclosed. You know, does the seller know the difference between a material fact and a material defect? Probably
Probably.
not without our explanation. And so we've got to kind of tease it out of them a little bit. Mr. Seller, is there anything you wouldn't want me to discuss? Well, I wouldn't want you to tell them how much I'm willing to accept. I wouldn't want you to give my bottom line. Okay, that's good. That's one of the exclusions. I can't talk about that. Is there anything else? Well, like what, Geoff? Well, is there anything going on in the neighborhood you don't want me to talk about? Is there anything going on about the property that you don't want me to talk about that's not related to the physical condition of the property? Such as, well, maybe there was a murder or on the property prior or something. I don't know. There's a stigma related to the property that they don't want discussed. That's not a material defect, it's a material fact. So we've got to kind of noodle it with them a little bit to
Yeah.
find out, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's some of the shortcomings we have with some of the agents. And this is, a disclosed dual agency is a limited type of agency, and it's only those 4 limits. We need to just kind of keep that in mind. Are we providing all the other fiduciary duties to both clients.
Right. And when
Fairly,
you look, yeah, and when you look at this, I mean, I've often thought, I mean, the law, it's described, it's disclosed dual agency. But interestingly, describing it more like limited agency is sometimes very helpful to think about, what it is and what's limited. I'm limited to what I disclose, willingness to take less, willingness to pay more, those four we just described. I'm also my fiduciary duties are limited. My duty of obedience is limited. My duty of confidentiality is limited. For example, let's look at some scenarios and see how that would apply. Right? Example number one, the seller plans to have some kind of negative influence next door. What do they plan on doing next door, Ed?
well, could be gravel pit, okay, on the adjacent property.
Yeah, they're going to go dig a gravel pit next door. Um, that is information that would influence a buyer maybe to know that, right? And I would have to tell a client buyer about that because it would influence my client buyer to know that. Seller doesn't want me to say that, do they? They want me to be quiet about it. Does the law require them to disclose that gravel pit next door?
Yeah,
I don't think so. No, no. And so they don't want that disclosed. But if I had a client buyer under dual agency, I'd have to talk about it, wouldn't I?
right,
Geoff, I don't want you to talk about it under a client buyer. So what does the seller do? Check the no box, right?
right, right, exactly.
You know?
Yeah, we've got a couple other little examples here too, Jeff. Says a murder in the listed property again after it was listed, could be even prior to when it was listed.
Yeah. Could be last year, last week, last month, yesterday. I hope it wasn't the last broker that showed the property.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
That wouldn't be good, but
No,
they don't want it disclosed. Now, a murder is not a material defect related to the physical condition of the property.
right.
It would influence a buyer to know about it possibly, but it's not a material defect. So it's not required to go to customers, but it would go to clients. And you, as a dual agent, you've got two clients, and the client, the one client doesn't want you to talk about that to the other client. Um, I kind of think that, there's an example of, under dual agency, I could not keep it confidential. Under dual agency, I cannot be obedient to the seller's discussion, to the seller's request that I not disclose it. I can't be obedient to that, and I can't keep it confidential. That's why my duties would be limited under dual. Those two fiduciary duties are limited. And so that's why there's a no box on dual agency if you run into this seller, right? Yeah.
I got another one here, competing comparative market analysis for both clients and sharing it with each other. Hmm, that could be a problem.
Well,
Maybe,
yeah, depends on the market, depends on your opinion of value. Have you ever had an overpriced listing? Have
yeah,
you have you ever had a seller that disagreed with the value, with your opinion of value?
yeah,
If they don't like your opinion of value, they shouldn't like dual agency because you would have to disclose that to a client buyer. Any client gets your opinion of value. Um, Seller doesn't want that, then they don't want dual. If they're okay with that, that's fine. That they're okay with your opinion of value being disclosed, that's fine for dual. But do they understand that? I don't know.
yeah. I don't know.
Speaking of understanding, that's a good idea, right? That the client understands what they're discussing, what they're signing, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Ex
they
ex
need to do that. And there's been a lot of, like I said, complaints to the commission. Buyers and sellers have signed documents they just don't understand, would not explain to them.
yeah. So good discussion at the beginning, at the time of brokerage agreement, revisit it, when you're showing your listing, revisit it when you're writing. You can revisit it 4 or 5 times, possibly. You know, they They could change their mind too. There's a reminder here. They can change they could say yes to dual. You know, I know buyers that have said yes to dual, and then when they finally find the property they want to make an offer on, and you discuss dual agency again, they're not too yippy skippy about you actually representing the seller too. You know, they don't like that idea. They don't like the fact that you're actually have divided loyalties, that you have two obediences, two loyalties. You know, they don't like that. And they change their mind to a yes or a no, depending on, you know, which way they went. They definitely change their mind going forward as the transaction progresses, right?
Yeah, absolutely they do. Yeah. Um, you know, they don't want to share sometimes, you know. I've had sellers feel that way. You know, I explained what disclosed dual agency is, and I had one client say, in other words, I have to share you with the buyer. Yeah, no, she said, no.
Yeah. Yeah, and so once again, you know, we've got another form here. There's all kinds of them in a real estate transaction, and explaining and discussing the forms is something that is so important. And you know, the discussion is it starts at the beginning of the relationship, and this form is a guide to the conversation with clients about agency roles and dual agency implications. If you actually start to work your way through discussing that little brief disclosure, agent licensees have done this for years, but they're really just kind of looking at the yes or no box. I actually heard one licensee say the seller said to them, "Well, tell me more about dual agency," and the licensee said, "Well, I've been doing it for 20 years and I've never had a problem. Are you okay with it?" That was their discussion on dual agency. I think that's a little lacking. I've done it forever. I've never had a problem. That's not an explanation of the limitations and the benefits and the potential issues with whether or not this is a dual agent transaction. We really need to get into the material fact information. The key to yes or no on dual is the material fact information related to that transaction. You know, and if there's material fact information that one party doesn't want disclosed, then that it's not a dual deal. If there's nothing that they want to hold back, then that's a potential of it could be a dual agent transaction, right?
Yeah, you know, Jeff, from time to time, we talk about when listing a property with a seller, and they say, okay, to disclose dual agency after we explain all of that.
Yeah,
And then we ask them, you know, is it all right if we disclose any interest in the property? And they say, oh, no, I don't want you to do that. You know, obviously they didn't quite understand what those limits are of
yeah,
disclosable agency.
yeah.
Because if you have a buyer client, you have to disclose any and all other interest. So,
Yeah, and you're going to regularly review these forms and agreements with clients to help ensure clarity. You know, we're going to reiterate it from the outset of the transaction and ensure clients understand that the role. Um, we're going to regularly educate clients on their rights and licensees' obligations. You know, it's a constant conversation that we have
yeah,
with them. And, you know, when we do this, we meet their expectations and they never, you know, there's not going to be a complaint as a result of that. Right. Yeah.
very good.